So today, we are so excited. We are so excited about, Florida. So let me tell you a little bit about Craig Pittman. We know Craig. He's no stranger to the area. He's here often and comes and plays with us. He is a native Floridian, graduated from Troy State University in Alabama. And I have to tell you about this. He worked on the student paper, and his work there prompted an agitated dean to label him, quote, the most destructive force on campus. Congratulations. Since then, he has covered a variety of newspaper beats and quite a few natural disasters, including hurricanes, wildfires, and, the Florida legislature. Since 1998, he has covered environmental issues for Florida's largest newspaper, the Tampa Bay Times. He's won the Waldo Prophet Award for the Distinguished Environmental Journalism in Florida 4 times, and twice won the Top Investigative Reporting Award for the Society of Environmental Journalists. Co-author with Matthew Waite of Paving Paradise, Florida's Vanishing Wetlands and the Failure of No Net Loss, and that was in 2009, which won the Stetson Kennedy Award from the Florida Historical Society. His second book was Manatee Insanity, Inside the War Over Florida's Most Famous Endangered Species, and that was in 2010, which the Florida Humanities Council named one of 21 essential books for Floridians. So today, Craig is here to join us, and he's going to talk about, Florida, how America's weirdest state influences the rest of the country. Join me in welcoming Craig Pittman to the podium.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Excuse me a sec.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for coming out today. I really appreciate it, and I hope we don't have to take tornado shelter here in the building, but if we do, well, that's typical of life in Florida. Anyway, my name's Craig Pittman. I'm a reporter with the Tampa Bay Times, Florida's largest newspaper, or as we like to call it, Florida's least shrinking newspaper. I cover environmental issues for the paper, which is the greatest job in American journalism, as far as I'm concerned, because number one, they have to pay me to go out and ride around on a boat now and again. But number two, I get to cover some of the really weird, wild, crazy stuff that happens here in Florida, like pythons battling alligators for supremacy in the Everglades, taxpayers footing the bill for the captive breeding of endangered rats at the Lowry Park Zoo, and somebody had to watch them. So if you ever feel like you have a bad job, just remember about the guy who had to watch the rats. Anyway, so I've collected some of these up. Let's see. They gave me a clicker. What happened to it? Yes. There we go. Okay. All right. And it's set on stun, right? Not kill? Okay. All right. Let's see if this works. Oh. There we go. Okay. So, so the book is divided up into chapters according to subject matter. So there's a chapter about growing up in Florida. There's a chapter about the beach. There's a chapter about driving in Florida, of course. And the last chapter is all about how I sort of argue that weirdness is everywhere in Florida if you know what to look for. And as an example, I talk about driving my son home from school every day and the things that we pass along the way. And the things we pass include the house where the case of the naked nanny occurred, a building that was hit by a runaway blimp, a place where there used to be a pirate ship anchored that had been used in both the SpongeBob SquarePants movie and also in a porn movie. And the city was not happy when they found out about the porn movie. And so after I had written the book and turned in the manuscript and it was at the publisher and it was too late to make any changes, one day we're driving home and we passed this lady who has climbed a big banyan tree outside the Museum of Fine Arts in downtown St. Petersburg. She's got on a colorful Eastern European costume of some sort. She's got her blonde hair up in dreadlocks, and she's dragged an accordion up there with her, and she is playing and singing John Denver songs at the top of her lungs. And so I pointed her out to my son, and I said, look, there's a lady up in that tree with dreadlocks and an Eastern European outfit and an accordion, and she's playing and singing John Denver songs. What do you think that's all about? And he said, who knows, Dad? It's Florida. And I said, okay, yeah, you got me there. I guess we're raising you the right way. But this is all part of living in what I call the most interesting state. We are, you know, like the beer commercials about the most interesting man in the world, that's us. We are the most interesting state. We have, for instance, we have more first magnitude springs than any other place in the entire world. First magnitude referring to how much water gushes up from down below in the aquifer. It was our original tourist attraction. In fact, people from up north would come down here to seek healing in the waters that were gushing up out of the earth. We also have more fake dinosaurs than any other state. Many of them at Dinosaur World over on I-4. I don't know if you guys have ever been to Dinosaur World. It's a really interesting place to visit. They've got, I think, they used to have 200 dinosaurs. I think now it's 199 because somebody stole one. They don't know how. They don't know why. But keep your eyes peeled. It answers to the name of Rex. The smallest police station in the United States is located in Florida. It's in the town of Carabel. It is a phone booth. And what I find fascinating about that is they still have phone booths, which you don't see those much anymore. The smallest post office in the nation is located in Florida. It's in the little town of Okeechobee. It's just big enough to slide the stamps in. And I always like to mention Sweetwater, the town in Miami-Dade County that was founded by a troupe of Russian circus midgets whose bus broke down. And they figured, well, this is as good a place as any to build our little tiny houses. And I am a native Floridian. I'm from Pensacola, and a lot of my friends who are natives say, you know, Florida didn't used to be weird, did it? It's all those people coming down from up north that made it weird. And I have to tell them, no, actually, we've been weird for a long, long time. Back even before we were a state, we were known as a rogue's paradise. One visitor who came here in the 1830s wrote that he thought that half of the people who lived in Florida were rascals and robbers and scalawags, and the other half were their penniless victims. So, you know, not much has changed, really. The first state flag that flew over the Capitol in 1845 when we became a state actually said, "Let us alone," which you could take as either a wish or a warning. Our first U.S. Senator, David Levy Yulee, he claimed he was descended from Moroccan royalty. Actually, he was just Jewish and he didn't want to tell people that. His great accomplishment while in office was that he put together the first cross-state railroad system and then steered all the federal mail contracts to it so that he put the money in his pockets, thus setting a very high bar for all the Florida politicians to come. The early settlers of Florida knew some things that we have forgotten in our current day. One of the things they knew is that without air conditioning, this place was really, really hot. And that's why they named so many places after hell. We've got Tate's Hell Swamp, Lake Helen Blazes, Devil's Mill Hopper outside Gainesville. Interestingly enough, one of the first people to develop a patented system for keeping people cool was a Florida man, Dr. John Gorey. He was trying to cool down his yellow fever patients, and so he developed this revolutionary system to put cool air through a building. Of course, because he was such a far-sighted visionary, people called him a crackpot, and he died penniless. But he now has a statue in Statuary Hall in Washington, D.C., representing Florida. Often the people who lived here back then did something illegal for a living because they figured the laws didn't really apply to them. They would lure a ship onto the rocks and then strip it of whatever goods were on board, or they would poach protected species. My favorites were the ones who lived in my hometown, where back when the Navy had wooden ships, the Navy went around buying up oak forests so they would have guaranteed lumber for building more ships. Well, people in Pensacola would sneak onto the Navy property and cut the trees and haul them off for their own uses. And the U.S. Marshal at the time wrote to his boss and said, "I can't arrest anyone because half the grand jury is involved." They also knew that life here could seem totally random. Nobody lived at the beach back then because they figured if you couldn't plow it, it wasn't worth owning. But they would visit the beach on a regular basis to pick up whatever the currents had washed ashore, and they would find clothing, they would find cookware, they'd find lumber, all kinds of stuff they could use. One time over on the East Coast, a ship washed on shore that had 300 coconuts on board. And the people who found it thought, well, what can we do with these? So they planted them, and that's how Palm Beach got its name. Another thing the settlers knew that we often forget is that Florida is constantly trying to kill us. And that's why I mentioned about the tornadoes. For instance, we are the sinkhole capital of America. We get more sinkholes here than any other state. That one right there, that may ring a bell for some of you. That actually occurred in Mulberry at a phosphate plant. It was so huge that people joked that it was the new Disney ride, Journey to the Center of the Earth. The new one that opened in Mulberry not too long ago, same phosphate plant, about 1.5 miles from where this one was. So I guess they're going for the frequent flyer miles on sinkholes. We are the lightning capital of the Western Hemisphere. We get more lightning here than anywhere else. It's a beautiful summertime light show that you probably are best observing from indoors. But as a result, there's a professor at the University of Florida who has a job that I think would be the envy of any teenage boy. He gets to go out on summertime, on those dark summer days when the clouds are hovering right above you, and then he has a rocket, and he'll shoot the rocket into the clouds with a copper wire trailing after it because he's trying to attract lightning that he can then take measurements of and study and so forth. And I'm thinking, you know, when I was 16, a job where you shoot off rockets and try to attract lightning, I would have thought that was the greatest job in the world. We are also the shark bite capital of the world. We get more people bitten by sharks here than anywhere else, including Australia. Most of them occurring over on the East Coast in Volusia and Brevard counties. I think it's because we taste so good. That's my theory. We have the most hurricanes making landfall in the United States. We had that 11-year gap there where we kind of had a little breather, and some people, I think, forgot that we got hit by hurricanes, but boy, we've gotten some pretty steady reminders in the last couple of years, haven't we? Also, we are considered to be among the most vulnerable places in the world to climate change. We're such a flat state. We're actually flatter than Kansas, and we're surrounded on 3 sides by water. So as the sea level rises, it encroaches further and further inland than it would in other places. So you put all those things together, the sinkholes, the lightning, the shark bites, the hurricanes, the rising sea levels, and of course that creepy clown college in Sarasota, and yet we call it a paradise. And we tell people, come on down and join us down here. Now, a lot of the weird Florida stories that you see involve some of the kooky critters that we have here in Florida. We actually have more invasive species that don't belong here than any other state. The pythons, of course, everybody knows about the pythons. Argentine tegus are the new thing. They're popping up all over the place. These big lizards with big teeth and a kind of a nasty disposition. I actually interviewed a guy in Hillsborough County who was taking his garbage out one morning, and he sort of sensed that something was following him, and he turned around and there was a tegu right behind him, keeping an eye on him. My favorite ones, though, are the giant snails, the giant African land snails that you find in Miami-Dade County and to some extent now in Broward County. They are as big as a man's hand. They will eat 500 different types of fruits and vegetables, some of them very commercially valuable. If they need it for their shell material, they will strip the stucco off the side of your house. They are hermaphroditic, so they don't need a mate in order to reproduce, and they reproduce a lot. The State Department of Agriculture is so freaked out by these things that it has purchased and trained dogs to sniff out the snail mucus in order to try and track them down and kill them. So no matter what other states may brag about, we are the only state with snail-sniffing dogs, so we should be proud of that. Although I feel a little bad for the dogs. I mean, you figure they go back to the kennel at the end of the day, and the other dogs are bragging, hey, I sniffed out some bombs today. How about you? Well, I sniffed out some drugs. How about you? I sniffed out some snail mucus. The other thing I like about the snails is their origin story. You know, all the superhero and supervillain movies we have now, you have to have the origin story. The giant snails have a great origin story. They were smuggled into Florida by a religious cult that thought that drinking the snail mucus would make you healthy. Of course, it has the opposite effect. What I particularly liked is that one of the people who smuggled them in was this lady who put several of them under her dress and then got on board a plane in Nigeria and flew to Miami that way. And I picture the guy sitting in the seat next to her, looking over and going, ma'am, did you know your dress is slowly undulating back and forth? We also have a lot of people who own exotic wildlife. One of my own neighbors for a while, I lived 5 minutes from downtown St. Petersburg, and one of my neighbors actually owned a pair of emus that he kept penned up in his backyard, and they would get out on a regular basis. I'd say about every 2 weeks. We'd see him chasing the emus up and down our brick streets, trying to catch them. One of my kids says that's his favorite childhood memory, is watching the neighbors chasing the emus. All it was missing was the Benny Hill music. But that results in a lot of these stories. So on the same weekend in 2013, we had this runaway llama up in Tallahassee, and in order to catch it, the cops had to use their tasers on it. And then in Pasco County, they had a runaway kangaroo, and the cops tried using their tasers on it, and it didn't work, so it ended up a guy who was a high school wrestling champ just tackled it and took it down. Things they don't cover in Police Academy, how to capture a llama, how to capture a kangaroo. More recently, we've had problems with people jumping on manatees that are swimming by and trying to ride them like they're carousel horses, because sure, that's what you do with an endangered species, right? Is, you know, try that with a panther sometime. The woman who kind of kicked that whole craze off, she was at St. Pete Beach one afternoon, and she saw a manatee swim by, and she jumped on its back and was like, "Woohoo, I'm riding a manatee!" And of course, everybody around her is yelling at her, "Lady, you leave the manatee alone, get off the manatee's back, stop." And when she wouldn't listen to them, then of course they all pulled out their phones and took video and shot pictures of her, which the sheriff's department then used to broadcast pictures and the video in order to try and figure out who she was. They caught her, she was charged. She got off kind of lightly from the court system, but I like to think that her true punishment is that pictures of her thighs were flashed around the world. More recently, we've had problems with people trying to ride sea turtles, which just doesn't make any sense to me at all. That is a really slow getaway vehicle, folks. More commonly, the stories result because we have built our homes in alligator habitat, bear habitat, and even Florida panther habitat, and then people are shocked when these animals show up in their backyards. You know, the panthers show up and gobble up their backyard chickens or start peeking through their sliding glass doors. Bears, I've seen lots of pictures, you probably have too, of the bears chilling in the backyard, hanging in the hammock, or you know, sitting in the hot tub. The gators are my favorites, though. I love the gators because, you know, I've lost count of how many stories there are about somebody who woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning, so it sounded like somebody knocking on their door, and they peek out the window, and it's an alligator slapping his tail on the porch. The gators, now is the time you see a lot of the gator stories, because they're in the spring, a young gator's fancy lightly turns to thoughts of love, and so they're wandering around looking for a mate, looking for love in all the wrong places. So, you know, we had a story recently about a gator that was strolling through a strip mall and stopped in front of the donut shop. And what I really love about the gators, though, two things. One is they are our first line of defense battling the pythons from taking over the Everglades. But number two, I know of 3 instances where alligators actually stopped suspects that the police were trying to chase. Talk about taking a bite out of crime. Florida has a lot of natural wonders that we should be proud of and brag about. We are the only state where the list of government jobs includes mermaid. This is at Weeki Wachee Springs State Park. If you haven't been there, I encourage you to go. It was built in 1947 by a former Navy frogman named Newton Perry, who looked at this spring and said, "I can do things with this." And so he built an underwater theater. He hid air hoses all around between the rocks, and then he hired these young women to pull on 60-pound prosthetic tails and swim around and do a little mermaid show for the tourists. And the business was pretty good up until the mid-2000s when it started to tail off. And so the state, rather than see this place shut down, stepped in and bought it and turned it into a state park. And so now the mermaids are state employees, and that has led to some interesting discussions about the use of tax dollars to pay for waterproof lipstick and shell bras. The very first national wildlife refuge in America was over on the East Coast. It was Pelican Island, designated by Teddy Roosevelt. There was a guy who lived on the next island over, and he was fascinated by this island that was always covered in pelicans. And then hunters started showing up and just started blasting away at the pelicans. It was during a time in the early 1900s when the big fashion for ladies' hats was to use feathers from Florida birds as decoration. So they were killing off roseate spoonbills, great blue herons, cattle egrets, and pelicans. And so this guy went to a very young, new organization that was just getting started, the Audubon Society, and he got them involved. They lobbied Teddy Roosevelt, and Teddy said, "We're going to protect these pelicans," and so he signed an executive order creating Pelican Island National Wildlife Refuge, and it was such a great idea that has caught on, and now there are hundreds of national wildlife refuges all over the country, and other nations are now copying our idea and setting up their own national wildlife refuges. This story has a classic Florida twist, though. The guy who was so protective of Pelican Island was hired as the first warden to watch out for the pelicans on Pelican Island. And he did that job very faithfully for 20 years, and then a hurricane blew through and all the pelicans left. And his boss said, "Well, I guess we don't need you anymore, you're fired." And of course, once he was gone, the pelicans came back. A Florida man co-wrote the Endangered Species Act. Nat Reed, he's still around. He started a new organization called 1,000 Friends of Florida, you may have heard of. Nat grew up in the Jupiter area. His mom said he was actually born holding a fly rod. That's how much he loves fishing. And he just fell in love with the natural bounty that he saw all around him, all of Florida's wilderness wonders. And so he was an official in Florida state government and helped protect Big Cypress National Preserve. And then he became an official in the Interior Department under Richard Nixon and was determined to do something to protect all of that natural wonder, all those natural wonders he had grown up with. So he and some like-minded people co-wrote the Endangered Species Act, got it passed by Congress, got Nixon to sign it. Among the species on that first endangered species list were a lot of ones from Florida: panthers, key deer, manatees, and the alligator. Believe it or not, alligators used to be an endangered species, and thanks to the protections of the Endangered Species Act, they've now come roaring back, so to speak. Now, a lot of Florida politicians contribute to our image of being a weird state. My favorite one is Governor Sidney Katz. He was governor around 1915. He always carried a pair of 6 guns on his hip because he said the Catholic Church was sending hitmen to kill him. In his stump speech, he would say, the Florida cracker only has 3 friends, Jesus Christ, Sears and Roebuck, and Sidney J. Katz. And that got him elected. Now, what I particularly liked about him, though, is, once again, the origin story. He was not a professional politician. He'd never been elected to anything before in his life. He was a Baptist minister from the Panhandle. And it just so happened there was a Baptist convention in Tallahassee. So Baptists from all over Florida converged on the state capitol. And the good people of Tallahassee threw open their homes so that people wouldn't have to pay for hotels. Just so happened Reverend Katz got to stay in the governor's mansion. And the whole time he was there, he was inspecting the place, top to bottom. He had lots of questions. And on the last day of the convention, he went and asked his most important question of all, which is, how much do you pay in rent? And Governor Park Trammell said, I'm proud to say that thanks to the taxpayers of Florida, I don't pay anything in rent. And Reverend Katz said, really? 3 weeks later, he filed to run for governor. In 1890, the mayor of Cedar Key, do you guys know where Cedar Key is? Have you ever been there? It's a beautiful little island in the Big Bend area. The mayor of Cedar Key set himself up as an island dictator. He hired a thug as his town marshal, and the two of them would walk around town with shotguns and order people to do random things for their own amusement. Hey, you two guys, headbutt each other. And then they'd walk on. Everybody was scared of these guys. In fact, the New York Times ran a story that called it a reign of terror in Cedar Key. Until finally this one woman, unfortunately we don't know her name, it's lost to history, but she wrote a letter to President Benjamin Harrison saying, please help us. Please get rid of these evil people. Everyone's scared of them. No one will stand up to them. Well, about that time, the mayor and his thug attacked the keeper of the customs house in Cedar Key, who happens to be, that was a federal employee. And so that gave President Benjamin Harrison all the reason he needed to send a Navy cutter to Cedar Key, and a group of sailors were sent into town with orders to arrest the mayor. So Cedar Key is the only city in America that underwent a military coup, believe it or not. Excuse me, speaking of Florida politicians, I need to take a Marco Rubio break here. So. Now I don't want you to think all this stuff happened in the long ago past. I mean, we still have weird Florida politicians. In 2016, we had a U.S. Senate candidate who claimed he had sacrificed a goat and drank its blood. And when I asked him what the blood tasted like, he said fame. I don't know what that means. He was a libertarian candidate. One of the Democratic candidates was a guy who had accused his own wife of committing bigamy, and her trial on that charge had to be postponed because one of her breast implants sprung a leak. Not a story you would see in any other state, I guarantee. Nobody from Florida has ever been elected president, which may be a good thing, I don't know. We've had a part-timer elected, a kind of obscure guy named Trump. I don't know if you heard of him. Just a part-time resident. But more often, Florida has been a sort of a block on presidential ambitions or something that has messed him up. There was a Florida man involved in the Lincoln assassination. He botched his assignment, of course. The Watergate burglars were all from Florida, botched their assignment, of course. We won't speak of the 2000 election follies that guaranteed no one will name a child Chad for the next 50 years. But my favorite example happened in 1987 when the front-runner for the Democratic nomination for president was a Colorado senator named Gary Hart. And there were rumors about Gary Hart, rumors that he was not faithful to his wife. And so Gary Hart told reporters, listen, follow me around, you'll see I'm a boring guy, none of this stuff is true. What Senator Hart didn't know is there were already reporters following him around from the Miami Herald because they had gotten a tip that he was having an affair with a Miami actress named Donna Rice. And sure enough, one night they caught Ms. Rice coming out of his Washington condo while his wife was out of town. And you know, they ran a story and he tried to bluster through and keep going with his campaign. But then another Florida-based newspaper got hold of a picture. And the picture just killed his campaign completely. And the picture showed him sitting on the dock in Miami next to a party boat. And Ms. Rice is sitting on his lap. And both of them with big grins on their faces. And Senator Hart was wearing a shirt belonging to one of the crew members on board the boat. And it had the name of the boat on it. And the name of the boat was The Monkey Business. And oh my gosh, the man's political career went totally down the toilet after that. He never ran for anything else after that. And I always mention this because the name of the Florida publication that finally nailed Gary Hart was the National Enquirer, which at the time was based in Lantana over in Palm Beach County. The National Enquirer was started by a guy named Generoso Pope Jr., who his godfather was literally a godfather. It was Frank Costello from the Mafia who gave him the money to buy the newspaper. Pope had previously worked as a psychological operations guy for the CIA. So if you look at the National Enquirer today and think, I wonder if that's a CIA operation. Well, who knows? Maybe it is. But what I love about Generoso Pope Jr., he was a very thrifty guy. And by thrifty, I mean he would squeeze a penny until Lincoln screamed. And so as a result, he pulled off what I think of as the greatest recycling project in American history. It happened at a time when most newspapers in America were switching from black and white presses to color, and most publishers were then just junking the old black and white presses, but Generoso Pope could not do that. He could not bear to throw anything away. So instead, he recycled those presses and started a new publication called the Weekly World News that ran completely in black and white. Its editors never let the facts get in the way of a good story. So the Weekly World News is the first publication to tell us that Elvis was still alive, told us that there was a bat boy living in a cave in Kentucky, told us that space aliens came down to Earth to make endorsements in the presidential races, and of course told us that half human, half fish were found in Florida, or as I like to call it, that's your first glimpse of Channing Tatum's costume for the Splash remake. Now there was another somewhat more serious publication that got its start in Florida. There was a newspaper named Florida Today that was launched by a guy named Al Newharth. Al Newharth was a Gannett Company executive who, Al was such a ruthless businessman, people said that when he put on his sharkskin suit, you couldn't tell where Al left off and the shark started. And Al could see the big boom that was going on in Brevard County as a result of the space program, and he said, you know, there's no daily newspaper there, they need a daily paper, and he persuaded Gannett executives to let him start one, and so they started Florida Today. It didn't look like any other newspaper that was around at the time because it was all in color. Even the comics were in color. It had these really jazzy short stories, little lists that didn't appear to connect to anything. And it became a huge success. And as a result, Newharth got promoted up through the ranks of Gannett and became the CEO. And so then he started a national newspaper based on Florida Today called USA Today. Basically, it took the same sort of DNA and made it on a national scale. So whenever you see a USA Today and one of those listicles that they run, that's a Florida product staring right at you. Now there is a chapter of the book that you wouldn't want to read at a Sunday school picnic. It's called The Sunshine State because promoters have been using sex to sell Florida to people all around the country for years and years and years. It actually started with Carl Fisher, the guy who dredged up the bottom of Biscayne Bay and dumped it on top of a mangrove island and called it Miami Beach. Carl Fisher decided that the best way to get people to come down to Miami Beach and stay at his hotels and buy his real estate was to pay women to put on what were then considered skimpy bathing suits, this is like 1917, and go stand out on the beach in February, and they'd take your picture and then send the pictures up to the newspapers up north, which of course would run them, and people would go, you know, the women would go, wow, look how warm it is, and the women would go, and the men would go, wow, look how hot it is, wink, wink, and they would come down to visit. Well, in the 1920s, the city of St. Petersburg actually did Fisher one better. Their PR man invented a phony Housewives Purity League. and had the Housewives Purity League file a formal complaint with the mayor about all the scantily clad women on the beach, who they refer to as sea vamps. And so there are all these great headlines in papers in like Pittsburgh in the 1920s. Sea vamps are stealing our husbands, say women in St. Petersburg. The iconic pinup model Betty Page, that's her in the picture, she was made famous by a Florida photographer named Bunny Yeager. That's Bunny there with the camera. Bunny herself had been a pinup model for a while, but had figured out she could make a lot more money behind the camera than in front of it, partly because she sewed her own costumes. So she actually parlayed that into a way of making a big success. She took the first picture of Betty Page that actually ran in a brand new magazine called Playboy, in fact. The most famous X-rated film of all time, Deep Throat, was filmed here in Florida. It was financed by the mafia. They definitely made their money back on that. And I have to mention that because of our warm weather, we have more nudist resorts here in Florida than anywhere else. We have every kind of nudist resort you could want. We have the high-end expensive ones, which honestly I don't know how you can tell they're expensive since nobody's wearing any clothes. And then at the other end we have one that's run by a group called the Bare Buns Biker Club, which honestly just sounds like a bad idea to me. The word chafing comes to mind. Anyway, they are a source of many great stories here in Florida. Back when Hurricane Irma was threatening Florida last year, one of my assignments was to call around to different places and see who was taking in hurricane evacuees. So I called up one of the nudist resorts and said, "Are you guys taking in evacuees?" And they said, "Yes, we've got a generator, we got power, we got space. So yes, anybody that wants to evacuate can come here. And the good news is you don't have to pack your clothes either." Now, where you have sin, of course, you have to have salvation. We have many forms of religion here in Florida. We've got the Christ of the Abyss statue underwater down in the Keys in case you feel like worshiping while you're scuba diving or snorkeling. In 2001, the mayor of a town called Inglis near Tampa actually issued a proclamation banning Satan from the town, and she posted the proclamation on the four corners of the town. It didn't keep the reporters out who came to write about it, though. In Miami, they have many people who practice a religion called Santeria, which involves animal sacrifice. And so if you have a relative who has a case coming up in court, often you will pay someone to go make an animal sacrifice at the courthouse. And so the janitors at the courthouse have formed what they call a voodoo squad to go out every morning and clean up all the headless chickens from the steps before they open for business. Not something that happens in any other state, just Florida. And back in the 80s, there was a televangelist named Jim Baker. He had a big multi-million-dollar operation based in the Carolinas. He was making so much money that his wife, Tammy Faye Baker, actually had an air-conditioned doghouse for her dog. And he threw it all away just to go have a little fling with a church secretary named Jessica Hahn in Florida. It happened at the Sheraton Sand Key Resort in Clearwater Beach. When news broke about it, of course, his whole empire completely crumbled. What I always found interesting, though, is what happened after that, which was people bombarded the Sheraton Sand Key management with requests to buy the sheets, the pillowcases, the shower curtain. They wanted to stay in the room. Radio DJs wanted to broadcast from there. I think this is one of those instances where the rest of the world went crazy and Florida went, what? And I always like to mention that the most prominent preacher in all of American history, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, he was arrested in 3 different cities in America, and one of them was Florida. He was leading protests in St. Augustine that ultimately led to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, banning segregation in public facilities, a very important measure indeed. He was arrested because he was trying to enter a motel restaurant to order a meal, and they wouldn't let him in. They stopped him on the steps and said, "You can't come in, this is whites only." And he said, "I'm an American citizen, you have to let me in and serve me." And they said, "No, this is whites only, get out of here." Finally, the management called the police. The police came and arrested him and hauled him off to jail. Fast forward about 25 years, and a new company comes in and buys the property and announces, "We're going to tear down the motel and the restaurant and build a Hilton here in St. Augustine." And the historic preservation people lost their minds and said, "Holy cow, you can't tear this place down. It's a historic monument. It's where Martin Luther King was arrested." And the Hilton people said, "Sure, we can tear it down. It's our property." And so the whole thing wound up in court, as things often do. And they went into mediation, and they came up with what I think of as a very Florida solution to this, which is the Hilton people were allowed to tear down the motel and the motel restaurant, but they kept the steps. So if you go to St. Augustine, you can go stand on the same steps where Martin Luther King was arrested, but like him, you can't go into the restaurant because it's not there anymore. Now, speaking of arrests, lots of our arrests end up making the news all around the nation because honestly, we have the craziest crooks anywhere. Back in November, I interviewed a lady from the Villages who had been arrested because they said she was shoplifting while dressed as a turkey. And when I said, ma'am, why were you dressed as a turkey? She said, it's Thanksgiving. Like, you know, hey, everybody dresses up like a turkey for Thanksgiving, right? More recently, we've had a guy down in Coconut Grove. I just think this is fascinating. Who he drove up to a home where they had a big flock of peacocks, and he trespassed on the yard and then grabbed one of the peacocks and made off with it. And you can see on the surveillance video, he's running with the peacock under his arm, and all the other peacocks are chasing him, and they are really angry. And the news down there compared it to watching Wile E. Coyote running. The TV show Cops was first filmed in Florida, and I think because of all the weird stuff that people saw, it became a big hit. And even its theme song, Bad Boys, became a big hit. Our concealed weapons law and our stand your ground law were the first of their kind in the country, and they've now been copied over and over again by lots of other states. I always like to tell the story of how two crooked cops ended up causing a revolution in American courtrooms. These guys walked the beat in Miami Beach. During the day, they would protect businesses on their beat. At night, they would go back and rob from those same businesses. They had walkie-talkies, and one would stand out on the sidewalk and stand guard, while the other one went in and rifled through the register. One night, a ham radio operator who lived in the neighborhood couldn't sleep, and so the guy got out of bed and turned on his radio and accidentally picked up their walkie-talkie conversation and realized what he was hearing. Oh my God, I'm hearing a crime being committed. So he tape recorded it, passed the tape along to the cops. The cops listened to it and go, oh my God, we know those voices. It's Bert and Ernie, you know. So they arrested the cops. They're put on trial. They're convicted pretty easily because of all the evidence against them. But their attorney appealed the case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Not based on the evidence, but based on the fact that there had been a TV camera in the courtroom at the time. Florida was undergoing a one-year trial of letting cameras in the courtroom just to see how it would work out. And this attorney contended that having that TV camera in there prejudiced the jury against his clients, and therefore the evidence should all be thrown out and they should get a new trial. And the Supreme Court said, no, we think it's okay to have TV cameras in the courtroom, and that's why we have TV cameras in our courtrooms today, so you can watch the O.J. trial, Casey Anthony, etc., gavel to gavel if you want, all because of two crooked Florida cops and a ham radio operator with insomnia. Now that's a Florida story. By the way, people often ask me, who's that guy in the picture? His name is Giuseppe Zangara. He attempted to assassinate FDR in 1933 in Miami Beach. He's a little guy, as you can see, so he had to stand on a chair to do it. And when he pulled out his gun, he hated rich people. That was his whole motive. That was his only motive. He just hated rich people. When he pulled out his gun, this woman standing next to him, you know, he's right on eye level with her, the gun, she saw what he was doing, so she grabbed her purse and basically beat the crap out of him. And so he missed. He missed FDR completely with 6 shots, but unfortunately, he hit the guy next to him, who was Anton Cermak, the mayor of Chicago, the guy who started the Democratic machine there. So Giuseppe Zangara was tried, convicted, and executed in 30 days, and his last words were, push the button. He's buried at Florida State Prison, where all of the grave markers are license plates, because that's what they make there. You know, they make license plates. So everybody's names are on license. So I went and tracked down his grave, and sure enough, they spelled his name wrong. Now, because our elected leaders are somewhat allergic to the idea of mass transit, we have to drive everywhere we go in Florida, and as a result, we are often ranked as having the worst drivers in America, but I contend it's because we have all the drivers in America, often all of them at the same time on I-4, I think. We also have the best road rage stories and the best car crash stories. My favorite road rage story is a headline in the Gainesville Sun that said, "Man in road rage incident runs over self." That takes some doing. In 2012, so many people in Florida crashed their cars into post offices that the U.S. Postal Service actually started running ads saying, please stop. We don't need a drive-through window. We're good. Thank you. But our need for speed gave birth to NASCAR here in Florida. It started in Daytona Beach in 1947, And it's still going today. A guy named Bill France Jr., who loved to drive really fast, got together some of his friends, and they set up the rules for NASCAR and so forth. And this is a very Florida sport because, other major sports like Major League Baseball, National Football League, et cetera, you have a group of owners who pick who the commissioner is, and the commissioner runs the league. No, this is a family-owned business. The France family still owns NASCAR. They make the rules. They make the decisions. That's the Florida way. Now, a lot of people ask me, what's the weirdest weird Florida story of all? And I have to tell them, I don't think that story's been written yet. We haven't quite hit the combination of, machete and naked people and pythons and so forth that you need. But there are some stories that if we had a weird Florida Hall of Fame, they would go in on the first ballot. One of them would be the guy who was competing in a pet shop contest to win a python. And what you had to do in order to win the python was you had to be the one who ate the most live cockroaches in a certain period of time. Classic good news, bad news situation. The good news is he won. The bad news is he died. And the medical examiner found that he choked to death on insect parts, which I wonder how often they check that box on the form, at the medical examiner's office. There's a town near Tampa called Gibsonton where a lot of circus folks retire to. In fact, it's so well known that it was actually the subject of an episode of The X-Files called Humbug, a very good one if you haven't seen it. Well, there was a guy who lived there named Lobster Boy. He had a deformity of his hands so they looked like lobster claws, and he used to go out on the sideshow circuit. Well, he retired there. Apparently was very abusive to his wife, so she hired a teenage hitman to take him out. It didn't turn out the way anybody expected, and so you know how they sometimes say that a trial is a circus? This trial was literally a circus where everybody who came to testify had been a circus employee. A classic one from 1930, there was a guy who lived in Key West. He called himself a count. He was more of a no account. And he was working as an x-ray technician, and he fell in love with one of his patients, the beautiful Maria. And his love for her transcended death, by which I mean that after she died, he dug up the body and lived with it for 9 years. Until her sister found out and reported him to the authorities. He was arrested, he was put on trial, and he was acquitted. And can you guess why? The statute of limitations had run out. But probably one of my all-time favorites is the one involving a lady in the picture there, Kathy Willits. She was, shall we say, entertaining customers at home for pay. And what the customers didn't realize is that her husband was in the closet with a video camera and a notepad, taking notes on what the customers liked and didn't like, and also their names. And one of the customers, there was a little argument, and he complained to the cops. The cops raided the place, and that's when they discovered that Mr. Willits was actually Officer Willits. He was himself a police officer. And so the two of them were arrested. The story, of course, made big headlines, especially when everyone found out that the client list was now in the hands of the authorities. And so a group of men, like 11 guys who all called themselves John Doe, went to court to keep the client list quiet. And so some very enterprising T-shirt people in Fort Lauderdale printed up T-shirts that sold very well that just said, "I'm not on the list." The case went all the way to the Florida Supreme Court, which ultimately ruled that if you're doing something naughty, you have no expectation of privacy. So the client list became public, and of course there were some very prominent names on the list of people who had been fighting against, X-rated bookstores and stuff like that, and yet they were doing this. I don't want to tell you the whole story. It's full of twists and turns, but I do want to mention that Mr. and Mrs. Willits claimed that what they were doing was actually marriage therapy, and it apparently worked because they're still together 20 years later. Now, I go into some detail in the book about why we produce so much weird news, but in sort of a short USA Today listicle form. We've undergone this wrenching demographic change in Florida. In 1940, we were the least populated southern state, and now we are the third most populous state. In 2014, we passed New York. So we have 20 million people who live here, plus we get 100 million visitors every year. And they're not evenly spread over the whole peninsula. We're all kind of crammed into that 30-mile wide swath along the coast or along I-4. So you put that many people together from that many different places, speaking that many different languages, and into that small a space, and they're bound to start ramming into each other's cars and chasing each other with machetes and arguing over whose dog pooped on whose lawn. And think about who these people are. We have ex-CIA agents who fell in love with Florida while they were training here for the Bay of Pigs. We've got retired carnies in Gibsonton, as I mentioned. We've got Hooters waitstaff, because the first Hooters was founded in Clearwater. We've got uniformed Scientologists, python wranglers, monkey breeders, spam kings, strip club moguls, and we've got 29 electoral votes in every presidential race. Our tropical climate means we're out doing weird stuff all year round, whereas people in like Ohio, you know, they have to be cooped up indoors because of the snow. And we actually do have, I talked to a machete distributor who told me they really do sell more machetes in Florida than anywhere else, which blows my theory that they were giving them away free at the state line with cups of orange juice. And I always have to mention, we are consistently ranked 49th among the states in spending on mental health treatment, to which I can only say, thank God for Texas. So, but my argument is that all this stuff that produces all the weird news stories, that we should be proud of that. I have friends who say, oh, I see a story come on the news, and I know there's going to be a Florida angle to it. There's always a Florida angle. You know, like the story about the emotional support peacock. Did you guys see that story? There's an airport in New Jersey where they wouldn't let this woman take her emotional support peacock on the plane. The peacock was from Florida, people. There's always a Florida angle. And so my friends are like, oh, I'm always horrified that Florida is in the news like that. And I tell them, don't be ashamed. Don't ever be ashamed of Florida. Let your Florida freak flag fly, because I think the same conditions that produce all those weird news stories are also responsible for producing that spark of creativity that helps us to influence the rest of the country. For instance, you know, we laugh about Florida Man, the exploits of Florida Man, the world's worst superhero. But the list of Florida men includes John Adanasoff, who grew up right here in Polk County in Mulberry. His dad was a phosphate mining engineer and always carried a slide rule. Young John became fascinated by his dad's slide rule, and that's what put him on course to eventually inventing the first computer. Jeff Bezos, now the richest man in the world, he grew up in Florida, started his first business here, and then went on to found Amazon. If his first business had failed, would we have ever heard from him again? Would we not now be, you know, dodging books dropping from drones on our heads? No, probably not. My favorite example, though, is the most popular author you probably never heard of, Donald J. Sobel. Donald J. Sobel wrote all the Encyclopedia Brown mysteries for kids. It sold 50 million copies all over the world, and he lived here in Florida. And if you read the books carefully, you realize he's describing the town where Encyclopedia Brown lives is a sort of an idealized Florida beach town. And what fascinates me about this is that Mr. Sobel was writing a lot of these books while living in Miami in the middle of the whole cocaine cowboy era in the 1980s. So, you know, the morning headlines are filled with stories about drug dealers masquerading as cops, busted by cops masquerading as drug dealers. Or one of my favorites, some cocaine smugglers who were trying to get away from a Coast Guard plane, so they threw a bale of drugs out of the plane, and it tumbled end over end and landed in the middle of a crime watch meeting in Homestead, and just missed hitting the police chief in the head. So I picture Mr. Sobel, you know, reading his morning paper, reading about all this crazy stuff, and then folding it up and putting it away, and then going to sit down and write another story where Encyclopedia Brown catches a bank robber because of his knowledge of Civil War trivia, you know, because that's the Florida way. But I mean, that's Florida for me. And you know, if you want to live someplace where the news is the same day after day after day, then you know, move to one of those square states out west, move to Nebraska or something. But if you want to live in a place where every day you open up the paper and go, wow, a guy punched a swan today, you know, then you're in the right place. And you should be proud of that fact and let your Florida freak flag fly. So, do we have time for questions? I can answer questions if people have any. And also, I brought some copies of the book. It's for sale over here for $17.
What was tricky about that last picture of the lady?
Oh, you like that one. Oops, wrong way. I'm sorry. That's in Weeki Wachee Springs. That was a picture that was taken in the late 40s. You can actually bring that.